Hello and welcome to Science Stories from Palomarin. I am Kristen Dybala, Principal Ecologist at Point Blue Conservation Science, and your host for this series of webinars. Today we're presenting episode 1, the very first episode of this series called How Are the Birds Doing? So today's webinar will feature Palomarin Program Lead and Senior Avian Ecologist Diana Humple, who I'll introduce in a minute. And she will be sharing with you a bit about the Palomarin Field Station and what we've learned about how the birds are doing based on our long-term research there. And then she'll introduce 3 of our conservation scientists for a broader discussion about how the birds are doing continent-wide and how our research at Point Blue is helping to address these huge conservation challenges. It should be a super interesting conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it. Today we are using Zoom in webinar mode. Let's see if we can get our slides going here so you can see what I'm looking at. There you go. Okay, so we're using Zoom in webinar mode. It should look something like this on this slide for you. In case you're, for those of you joining us in Zoom directly, there's a divider in between me and my slides that you should be able to drag sideways to make more space for the slides or the speaker as needed. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. We'll be saving some time at the end to answer your questions, and you can submit questions there at any time. For those of you joining us on Facebook, we have Lishka Arada, our Senior Communications Coordinator, who will be scanning for and compiling any questions that come through via our live stream there. If you do lose your connection at some point, not to worry, we've all been there. We'll also be recording this webinar and we'll let you know where to find that soon afterwards. And if you run into any technical issues with Zoom that you can't figure out, we also have Zach Warno standing by to answer email or phone calls. His info is on this page, and we can also paste that again into the chat a bit later. Okay, on to the next slide. If you're new to Point Blue Conservation Science, welcome. We are so glad you're joining us today. We are a nonprofit science organization, and our mission is to advance the conservation of birds, other wildlife, and ecosystems through science, partnerships, and outreach. The Palomarin Field Station is very much the heart of Point Blue. It's our original headquarters and has been an active field station year-round for over 50 years. And it's where many of us trained to become the conservation scientists we are today. This summer, we launched the Palomarin Field Station Data Explorer, which is a series of interactive web pages. Oh, there we go, where you can dive into some of the most important science stories emerging from our long-term research and find out why it's so important that we're able to continue collecting those data. Those stories include what we've learned from studying climate change, habitat change, and migration routes, and how those all tie into today's big question, how are the birds doing? In this webinar series, we are exploring each of those major science stories further in conversation with the scientists and partners who have contributed to them. You can find the Data Explorer at pointblue.org/Palo Data Explorer, and we hope you'll visit after today's webinar. So next slide. Today's webinar is focused on this big question, how are the birds doing? Many of you may have seen a major study that came out last year that estimated we've lost nearly 3 billion birds across North America since 1970. This is, of course, a huge conservation challenge, and we wanted to dive deeper into this with a conversation about what we're seeing at the Palomarin Field Station and in our other research at Point Blue, what some of the causes of these declines are, what we can do about it, and how it's not all bad news. So to kick this off, I'm going to turn it over to Diana Humple, Palomarin Program Lead and Senior Avian Ecologist. Diana coordinates the science, training, and outreach that her team of staff and interns conducts at Palomarin and throughout the Bay Area, along with many other important hats she wears at Point Blue. So welcome, Diana.
Thanks, Christy, and hopefully you all can hear me. Thanks also to all of you who are joining us today, including our 3 panelists who I will introduce to you in a few minutes. I wanted to start by giving an introduction to the Palomarin Field Station. For those of you who aren't as familiar with us, we're located in Point Reyes National Seashore in Marin County, California. And being a field station essentially means that we are studying one place deeply and over time so that we can gain scientific knowledge about the local area that we can apply locally, as well as sharing and applying it more broadly. And at Palomarin, our focus is studying the songbird community, which Point Blue has been doing since 1966. And our ultimate goal is to understand how birds are responding to local and regional environmental change. And among other things, this can help us predict how they might be expected to respond to future conditions. And we do this in a few ways. We catch birds with mist nets and band them so that we can monitor both the individuals and the populations. We also search for and monitor nests and map the territories of the species that call this place their home during the breeding season. We study the weather and the vegetation here. And we also serve as a hub for other bird monitoring projects that Point Blue does in the Bay Area. And I would normally invite you all to come out to the field station and see live bird banding demonstrations, but we are closed to the public because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So stay tuned for when you are able to visit for your first time or to return here. And in the meantime, I would encourage you to explore the online Palomarin Data Explorer, to check out other webinars like this one, and also to tune into some of our Facebook Live events. We actually have one this Friday on November 20th, where you can see a live bird banding demonstration virtually. So one of the main questions we are interested in and that directs our work is, how are the birds doing? And I'll share just a tiny bit about what we've learned here at Palomarin. And then in our panel discussion, we'll discuss that a bit, as well as how that looks more broadly. As you can imagine, it is a pretty complicated question and not one with a one-size-fits-all answer. So consistent with what Christy mentioned about the loss of 3 billion birds across the continent, we're also finding that across the last half century or so that we've been studying birds here at Palomarin, there are fewer birds than there used to be overall, and also during each of the seasons in which we've been studying them. And this graph is actually taken from the online Data Explorer, which you can check out and actually interact with when you have a chance. So this next slide shows you a couple examples of this for our focal species. So our focal species are the species that we study the most intensely here at Palomarin. And you can again go to the online Data Explorer and look at all of the species that we've done this for. So in this example, you can see that white-crowned sparrows are declining here, and this has been happening as the habitat around us has become far less suitable to them. But it is not all doom and gloom. We do have some species like the Wrentit that are either stable or increasing. And the bottom line is that not all birds have the same needs, and not all of them are going to respond in the same way to environmental change. So that's one of the reasons why it's really important to study the entire bird community. And much of our work involves teasing apart how these patterns that we are interested in identifying are influenced by things like climate change and habitat change and where birds spend their year, because many species are migratory and actually are only in the Point Reyes area for part of their annual life cycle. So these factors are all themes that you can find on the Palomarin Data Explorer, and that we're going to have as themes as future webinars like this one, but probably our panelists will touch on some of this a little bit today as well. I wanted to briefly mention another major component of our work at Palomarin, which is to provide early career training to biologists through our internship program. And these interns, and there have been over 700 from over 20 countries over the years, have all played a huge role in our exploration of how bird populations are doing. And this is a segue to introducing our three panelists, as all of them were interns at Palomarin once upon a time, as was I, and all three of them have played a vital role in Palomarin's intern training and science for years, even decades. Each of them also brings a unique perspective to the conversation that we're having today about how are the birds doing at Palomarin and beyond. Geoff is Director of Strategic Partnerships at Point Blue. He works nationally and internationally on a variety of scientific efforts and partnerships. He previously directed the Palomarin Field Station and led the field work and including the nest searching and banding and the training that takes place here. We refer to him as the Wrentit whisperer. He has probably found more Wrentit nests than any other human being on the planet. Welcome, Geoff. Tom Gardali is the director of our Pacific Coast and Central Valley group at Point Blue, where he directs Palomarin along with dozens of other projects. And his research focus includes ecological restoration and evaluating the impacts of climate change on wildlife. At Palomarin, he has been helping to guide the science, the training, and the fundraising that we do here for the past 2 decades or so. Welcome, Tom. And Renée Cormier is an avian ecologist here at Point Blue and one of our trainers and supervisors at the Palomarin Field Station, which she has been doing for nearly 15 years and where she has trained over 100 interns. She also studies songbird migration and leads some of our other landbird monitoring efforts in the region, including with northern spotted owls. Welcome, Renée. Great to have you all on here. And let's dive in with the first question, which is actually going to go to each of the 3 panelists in turn. And we will be starting with Renée on this one. So you each have a personal connection to Palomarin that I alluded to. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that connection and what that experience has taught you about how the birds are doing at Palomarin and beyond and why that is important.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. Well, Palomarin was where I was offered my first opportunity to study birds as a banding intern in 2002. And I do still remember that very first bird that I had the opportunity to band was a tiny ruby-crowned kinglet. And the care that my trainers took to not only make sure that safety was a top priority, but also that the data that I was collecting were taken accurately and with the focus being on this very repeatable measure. And so that early emphasis of like, these are long-term data sets and we want the data that we collect today to be comparable to those that were collected decades earlier, really was just the beginning of that, like instilling how the long-term data have been important here.
Thanks, Renée. How about you, Tom?
Yeah, hi everyone. Happy to be here. You know, back in 2003, I was doing an internship, just not a bird internship. It was an internship on an organic farm very near the Palomarin Field Station. And during that internship, I would volunteer on weekends at Palo to do bird banding. My sort of life plan at the time was to own my own organic working farm and that also to be an active research farm with grad students, et cetera, running around doing research. But after that ag internship ended, I was offered a formal internship at the Palomarin Field Station, and here I am. It obviously changed my life plans for the better. I still enjoy agriculture, but I'm so glad I made this decision. The thing about Palomarin is that I got to learn about birds, not just about banding birds and understanding them in that way, but I located nests. I got to ID them by sight and sound. And I think that when you start to pay attention to birds, you realize that there's been a world around you your whole life that you didn't know existed. And that really was a life changer for me in an important moment. I started to think, well, why is this bird here now? Why isn't that bird not here? Pay attention to seasons like I hadn't before. I realized that birds were telling me something, then I should probably listen. And that's what Palomarin did for me. It also wasn't just the birds, it was the people. I very much enjoyed the people. It was a lifestyle I thought that I could, that was a good fit for me. And science is certainly something that I'm interested in. So sort of to get back to your question about what Palomarin taught me and continues to teach me, and it's things like to pay attention. I thought I was paying attention before, but not until I got to Palomarin. Taught me to be patient, because understanding takes a long time. Taught me about the importance of data, especially long-term data, and taught me to tell the stories that those data have so we can make better decisions as a society.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. And I do hate to break it to you, but you came to Palomarin in 1993, not 2003.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that.
Just in case anybody listening who knows you got confused by that. Sometimes
That's
we
right.
can't
Thank you
believe
for
that
that.
we've been here as long as we have. Thanks. And Geoff, go ahead with your thoughts.
Oh yeah, yeah. Palomarin is a very special place to me. It's obviously, you know, I came here in 1980 before computers, just to age myself a little bit. But I was sent down here after graduating and wanting to get into a field job. And, you know, somebody said, actually it was Rich Stallcup's cousin, who said, if you really want to learn birds, you got to go to Point Reyes Bird Observatory. So I came and been here ever since. And yeah, again, it's a very unique place. I always like to say you can live and breathe birds like no place else, intently to study organisms. And it's a community approach, an ecosystem approach. It's not just a single species. You really get to look at the interactions between species and plants and weather over and contribute to a long-term database. So it really is a unique and special place. Couple other things about it is the internship program, which we're all we're a part of, but it still it always amazes me as how unique that is. You know, I think some people call it a finishing school for field biologists, but it really allows people to live and breathe birds for months on end and get an intimate knowledge that changes their lives. And a lot of these interns go on to play. I'm still working with a lot of them now in high-level places across the continent, and being able to make a difference. And I always know if they've been a Palo intern that they get it. They know what they need to do. They know the complex relationships between species and plants and weather, so that we can make those kind of conservation investments that'll mean something. Finally, Palomarin is open to the public, and interns interact with, you have to explain their science and explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. So it really provides that, what I call community of practice. It forces scientists to be social, to be able to explain the kind of work they do and why it's important, and live in a community where they have to be interactive and collaborate. And collaboration, as I will probably talk about later, is all about is if we're going to get conservation done, if we're going to save these 3 billion birds or reverse these declines, we've got to collaborate.
Thanks very much, Geoff. And yeah, he touched on the fact that we are normally open to the public, and that public outreach is a big part of what we do. If any of you missed that before, we're unfortunately not open to the public these days, but look forward to being so again soon. I have a question that's specifically for Renée right now, which is that we often hear about the winners and losers in conservation. I alluded to something along those lines in my introduction too. Some birds at Palomarin seem to be doing well and increasing, while others are declining. And you recently did an analysis looking at birds elsewhere in Marin County and found that similar mix. And I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts on why we see such mixed responses.
Sure. So there's a number of reasons why some species might be increasing while others are declining in the same area. Or in some cases, a species may be increasing or decreasing locally, but if you look at it on a broader scale, you might find that opposite trend. And so that's why it's important to look at trends that we're seeing both locally and on these broad scales. And Diana, you showed the example in your introduction of the white-crowned sparrow. And I think that's one example of, you know, one big thing that can be driving these different trends is habitat change. Habitat change by could be in response to fire, restoration, habitat succession, like we're seeing at Palomarin, where the white-crowned sparrow is declining in response to this conversion from shrub to forest. However, at the same time, Swainson's thrushes, a more forest-associated species, has been stable in our net captures and even increasing during in terms of the number of breeding territories at Palo. At the same time, in that analysis, local analysis we did, which was from our long-term bird work in the Marin Municipal Water District lands on Mount Tamalpais, we also found stable trends with Swainson's thrush. However, if we look at a broader scale at the level of the state of California, that species is declining. Another reason for differences in trends among species might be whether or not they're migratory or resident. So for example, a species at Palomarin who spends its entire life there is under the influence of the weather and climate and habitat at Palomarin only, whereas a migratory species is going to be also responding to changes that could be occurring thousands of miles away, as well as the places in between during their migratory route. Climate change is, of course, affecting every stage of the life cycle of birds, and some may be responding differently than others, even within the same area. And again, with those migratory versus resident species, climate change is not behaving in the same way everywhere across the globe. So there may be different and unique pressures depending on where birds are spending their lives.
Great, thank you so much, Renee. And now I'm going to pivot to Tom and ask him a specific question, which is given these declines, including some that we're seeing locally at Palomarin and what we're seeing regionally and continent-wide with 3 billion birds mentioned earlier, what factors are driving this, both what we're seeing locally and beyond?
Yeah. So, you know, when it comes to bird declines, there are some big driving issues, some big threats. But really the magnitude of change that we are seeing at Palo and North America and globally, really, we're in a sort of a death by 1,000 cuts situation. So what are the big drivers, right? And the big drivers, hands down, is habitat loss and degradation of what habitat remains. If you just think about the Central Valley of California, where I'm from, we've lost over 90% of our wetlands and riverside forests. How can that not impact birds, right? We've got 10% of that left. But if you think about Palomarin's in a national park. It's got about as much, it's surrounded by as much protected lands as it can be. And even within that, there are state parks nearby. We're up against another national park, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. There's amazing agricultural easements in the county. But as Renee talked about, Palomarin is really not just sampling birds that happen to be in the national park their whole lives. It's sampling birds from across many countries and many thousands of miles. And so what we're seeing is the power of one single place to tell us about what's happening on this very large scale. And so while we might not be seeing habitat loss near the field station, we are seeing habitat change. And we might be birds might be telling us stories about habitat loss elsewhere, say, for example, on their wintering grounds. I have to mention climate change as well, right? I mean, climate change is the threat that touches all other threats. Climate change doesn't care if the land is protected or not. It doesn't follow geopolitical boundaries. And it really challenges what we might do to address bird conservation issues. If you think about just one aspect of what climate change is projected to do, drought, for example, we know that drought will become more frequent and more severe, and drought influences plant communities. We may see loss of plants, or we may see just plants have less vigor. They're not as green as long. That could influence cover for nests, insect abundance. And we know from our work at Palomarin that nest cover is really important for reproductive success. So while drought might not kill birds directly, those sorts of small things that impact reproductive success, for example, is one example of sort of this death by 1,000 cuts idea. I really want to mention one more because it's more on my radar lately, and it used to be a primary focus of the environmental movement, and that's insecticides, with DDT causing so many declines primarily in raptors for so long. So these days we don't have DDT anymore, but our new crop of insecticides, and this was news to me, are far more toxic than DDT was. And so we need to start paying attention to the role of these insecticides in our bird communities. And they're neurotoxins. They can kill birds outright, but even if they don't, as they're processing, going through a bird's system, it will impact that bird's ability to forage. It may slow down its migration, and all of these small things that add up to these population declines that we're seeing. It's no one thing, it's all of these certain things. But just like the DDT story was so bad, it also points to that we can reverse these things, right? Once DDT was removed, we saw raptors have a massive recovery. And even here in Marin County, where eagles were missing for a bald eagles were missing for a long, long time, I see them regularly at my house. So we can make changes to these big threats that are impacting bird populations.
Great, thank you, Tom. And we actually are going to start segueing into talking about some of the actions that conservation organizations and individuals can be taking in response to some of these threats. And hence my next question, which is for Geoff. So Geoff, the loss of 3 billion birds is indicating this huge continent-wide conservation challenge, as Tom's been talking about. Can you share with us a little bit about how Point Blue is involved in addressing these population declines, and what are just some of the overall strategies that are taken?
Yeah, thank you, Renee. Yeah, that's, or Diana, that's a huge question, big question, as you well know. Lots of lessons we've learned from Palomarin, and trying to take those at a continental level. As you heard from Renee, these birds, a lot of these birds spend their time across across the entire continent. Their wintering grounds much different than their breeding grounds. So finding out where these populations are limited is huge. What we call it, to do that, we look at the demographics of a population, their demographic monitoring, looking at their birth rate, their survivorship rate, how they do during migration, and some of those things that we can actually get information on that. Before, a lot of the focus was just counting birds and knowing how many were there. But if we're going to identify where these birds are having problems, their bottlenecks, we need to do what we call demographic monitoring. So this mist netting allows us to look at survivorship of birds, their return rates. It also allows us to look at productivity, as well as nest finding does. So again, we took a lot of these methods that were pioneered at Palomarin and applying them at a national level through things like Partners in Flight, which started about 30 years ago. Which was a big effort to stop the decline of songbirds. And we're entering our 30th year. We've held various high leadership positions in that, still very active in that. And also the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, which also was one of the keys behind that 3 billion bird loss. And how do we do this on a continental scale? How do we identify problems and where we can make a difference? And we went back there about a year ago when that paper first came out, and came up with all the NGOs that are involved in these efforts, came up with what we call our 5 game changers, with the big efforts to look at how we can make a difference. One of them being, the new science, where we can actually identify where these problems are having. We're using things like Modus towers, or some of the work that's going on at Palo, identifying where these birds are wintering and how those places are doing. But probably the first game changer, which I think is probably the most exciting, is collaboration, is people working together. And if we're going to work on the wintering grounds in Mexico and South America, as some of you heard yesterday that Point Blue is doing great with shorebirds and the shorebird program, we need to do that with landbirds. And how do we do that? It's unprecedented collaboration. So working together at scales that have not been achieved before. And the amazing thing is that we know that works. There's been great examples from the waterfowl management folks when they started the National North American Waterfowl Management Plan back in the mid 80s. And correspondingly, waterfowl are increasing now, thanks to all the efforts of a lot of different partners to put more wetlands on the ground across the continent. And we want that same level of effort to go to upland habitat, to forested habitat, to songbird habitat, and coordinate that across levels that we've not seen before, and get the funding to make that happen. So that's a lot of the efforts that we're doing at a national or continental level. Lots of traveling, lots of visits. The nice thing is, every place I go and all these initiatives, I constantly are running into Palomarin interns who are already doing a lot of the great work. The science coordinator for Partners in Flight, Becky Keller, is a former intern, as well as the shorebird coordinator for the East Coast, Scott Johnson, for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So everywhere I go, I run into a Palo intern, and that makes our work a heck of a lot easier to collaborate.
That's great. Thanks so much, Geoff. And I think we'll slightly continue along that vein. And Tom, just ask you if you could tell us a little bit more about Point Blue's approach to conservation.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Interestingly enough, I've been using a quote from Dwight Eisenhower to do so. And I think it does a good job because it, at least at the 30,000 foot level, and the quote goes something like this. This isn't an exact quote. It goes, if you can't solve a problem, you need to enlarge the problem. And by that, it means perhaps we've taken too narrow a view of what the problem is and too narrow a view of what the solution set is. So we need to enlarge it. We need to step back and take a look. And, for birds, this could be things like, do we go species by species to try to save them? Or do we take a look at the entire ecosystem? Or to enlarge that even more, do we look at the social and ecological systems together, right? So an old question might have been, how do we reverse the decline of species X? And the new question might be something like, how do we get more resources and capacity put towards bird conservation? And so with that sort of enlarged example of how we do our work, we've kind of embraced this idea of multiple benefits. This idea that a conservation project or an action will have benefits to wildlife, ecosystem function, and other values of society as well. An example is a restoration project. A simple example might be that we can do a restoration project that benefits birds. It can also capture carbon from the atmosphere and store it. And it can also perhaps even provide those important cultural plant species for local Native Americans. And those are some things that we are actually involved with at Point Blue. So the appeal and strength of the multiple benefit approach is that we can bring more capacity and we can bring more resources to bear on a project or a topic that a single issue wouldn't be able to do, right? Flood control and bird habitat, protecting an area for recreation and bird habitat. All of these sorts of different things brings diverse interests to bear on a project. And so we can bring in more resources and we can bring in more stewards and they can bring their different perspectives. So the conservation can actually be more durable, right? And to do so, we need to be genuinely inclusive. We need to hear from multiple perspectives, multiple worldviews, and multiple voices. And I'll just say a little bit more about how we work. And Geoff mentioned collaboration, and I think partnerships are one of the things that we value and try to do our best at Point Blue. And it's not easy to do partnerships, but it is so critically important. And one of the sort of traits of how we try to be good partners is we try to be an organization that listens. And by that, I mean, we're not just listening for content, so I can hear what you say and repeat it back, but we're actually trying to listen with a willingness to change our perspective. And I think that's really important in conservation. It's something we strive to do.
Oh, excellent. Thanks so much, Tom, for all of those thoughts. And Renee, I want to bring this back a little bit to a more local scale then and ask you what kind of recommendations have we made to some of the local land managers that we work with about how to conserve birds?
Yeah, so one of the recommendations that might not surprise folks listening here is to continue long-term monitoring of these species in order to identify when one or more species might be in need of management intervention. Without monitoring, how will we know how the birds are doing? We've made recommendations to study specific habitats that may be under heavy pressure. Tom mentioned riparian or these riverside habitats that have been greatly reduced in California and are very, very important to many bird species and other wildlife as well. In some cases, we recommend species-specific studies when appropriate. It's not always possible to understand every species by these community studies. The northern spotted owl, a species very near and dear to my heart that I've been studying, is an example of that, where this species-focused study is really important for understanding them. We've also recommended studying bird response after fires, such as the 1995 Vision Fire here in Point Reyes National Seashore. In general, as well, we've really recommended the importance of disturbance on the landscape, whether that be fires or floods, which can help create a more diverse mosaic of habitat types, such as grasslands, shrublands, and forests, that can then help support a more diverse bird community. And finding ways that allow these disturbances to happen safely, or mimicking them with management activities, such as prescribed burns, for example. Those are all things that we can recommend to local land managers to help to support a diverse and healthy bird community.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Renee. And I have one final question for all three of you. We are going to very soon pivot to hearing about any questions that might have come in from the viewers. And this final question is, what else can the public then do to help reverse these declines that we're talking about? And let's go ahead and start with Tom on that one.
Okay, well, I'll give a general answer, and maybe others can be more specific. But you know, conservation needs more capacity. It needs more hands. It needs more minds, and it needs more dollars. We've seen examples where there has been capacity, both in terms of will and dollars. And Geoff mentioned waterfowl. Waterfowl have that kind of attention, and their populations in North America are mostly doing great. So we can make the change when we have that kind of capacity. We know that spending for the environment, among all spending, whether it's government or philanthropy, is always the lowest, right? The environment doesn't get that much money. But we know that if you have healthy bird populations, you're likely to have a healthy environment. And we know that a healthy environment is good for human health. I think we're living in an example of that right now and have been doing so since March. So if you can afford to give, please give. If you can't afford to give, then bring your many talents to bear on these issues. There's opportunities to volunteer, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just mention one more because it is also near and dear to my heart. I mentioned that one of the big threats to bird populations worldwide is loss of habitat. And so ecological restoration is going to be absolutely critical for that. So as much capacity as we can bring to that, I think will be an excellent bang for the buck.
Great, thanks, Tom. And Renee, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Sure. I can get more specific even to, elaborate on Tom's suggestion for habitat restoration. Folks can plant native habitat in their yards or volunteer with local groups who are doing restoration or invasive plant removal. Keeping cats indoors is always a top recommendation for bird lovers. Even well-fed cats can eat birds or other wildlife. Avoiding pesticides, again, we heard earlier about some of the negative impacts that can cause to birds and to the insects on which they depend. As a local spotted owl biologist, I always also want to make the recommendation to avoid using household rodenticides because the owls and other raptors that eat those poisoned rodents can themselves become sick. Reducing plastic use is another important one. A lot of plastics end up in the environment and can be ingested and are ingested by seabirds and other wildlife. And if you're a coffee lover like me, shade-grown coffee is a great choice for birds. So you can look at the packaging of your coffee and seek out coffees that are bird-friendly. I'll stop there, but there are more.
I'm sure there are, and thanks, Renee. And actually, Geoff, if you have anything you wanted to add to that list, that'd be great.
Oh, I've been working a lot in the Working Lands program and with the ag industry, and something that it's really been coming to me, home to me, is to know where my food comes from. You can really make a big difference in a lot of those things Renee was talking about. Choosing grass-fed beef over industrial beef, it can really make keep ranchers ranching, which it keeps land in bird habitat and carbon sequestration. Lots of multiple benefits by allowing ranchers to ranch. the other one that I always mention, is being able to read landscapes, observe carefully. This is a Leopold quote: "Observe, participate, and reflect." Again, careful. Get out there, look at your landscape, look what's working, look what's not working. Participate. You can collect data by contributing your bird list to eBird, or acting, going to your local land use meetings and making a stand for lands that prefer habitat. And that's all participation. And then reflect, listening, like Tom was talking about. Something is really important. A lot of people know, especially ag industry ranchers, know a lot about what's going on out there. So being able to reflect and incorporate and listening is huge. We don't know all the answers, and we have to do it as a community approach.
Great, I really appreciate all of that. And now we're going to transition. We're going to bring Kristi Dybala back into our conversation and start with the question and answer session.
Hi, everybody. So thank you so much to all of our presenters and to Diana for leading this important conversation. I really appreciated hearing all of your perspectives. So we have saved some time to answer audience questions, and we have had quite a few come in. It's not too late to submit your question. If you're joining us in Zoom, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining us on the Facebook live stream, you can answer questions there as well. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Before we start with those, I wanted to remind you to please check out the Palomarin Field Station Data Explorer. This is our interactive website we've been mentioning a couple of times that lets you dive into our decades of data. You can find that at pointblue.org/Palo Data Explorer. I also want to let you know how to make sure you hear about future webinars like this and other Point Blue events. You can sign up to our email list by going to pointblue.org/sign-up. We'll put these links in the chat too, so you can copy them down later if you miss it. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We do have a live bird banding demo planned for Friday morning that you can find on Facebook. And then we are planning to host at least 3 more episodes of this series, diving into more detail about those 3 major factors we heard that are affecting birds today: climate change, habitat change, and migratory routes. We haven't finalized the dates for those yet, so make sure you sign up to get those announcements. We are also a nonprofit science organization that relies on donations to support our conservation research, our intern training, and our public outreach efforts like this. So if you enjoyed this webinar and would like to support our conservation efforts, please consider giving us a donation at pointblue.org/donate. I've noticed several of our donors are attending today, some of whom have been supporting Palo and Palomarin and Point Blue for decades. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your support. Okay, let's move into Q&A. And let's see here. So we've had quite a few questions. The first one is a pretty fundamental one, and maybe I'll let Diana take first crack at this, which is, what is bird banding?
Yes, thanks. So bird banding, we basically catch birds in a variety of ways, including in these large nets that are passively set up in our environment in order to put a unique identifier on the bird's leg. So it's literally a silver band that's super light. So it does not, provide a problem for the bird in terms of weight. And it has a unique number on it that's kind of like a social security number for humans, that wherever this bird travels, if it's one of those migratory species like Renee and I talked about, whoever catches it, we can still attribute that bird back to our capture here at Palomarin. And it allows us to keep track of that individual, which then allows us to scale up to looking at the population as a whole. And that is the piece that I wish that I could invite you to join right now, and that we do have that Facebook Live event on Friday, November 20th, because getting a chance to watch the scientists doing it and seeing a bird in the hand that's just been captured and is about to be released back into the wild is a really great experience.
Thanks for that. Kind of a related question to your introduction to this. We think of Wrentits as scrub birds. Why aren't they negatively affected by the encroachment of the Doug fir forest?
Did you want me to take that one too?
Sure, if you want.
Well, that is a wonderful question. And in fact, we would have predicted, and perhaps all of us did, that we would see similar, maybe not quite as extreme declines in Wrentits as we saw in white crowned sparrows and as we're also seeing in song sparrows right here at Palomarin. But Wrentits, one of the things that's very unique and special about Wrentits is that they are very attached to where the area where they were hatched. And in fact, they don't move very far in their entire life. Some Wrentits don't move more than a few hundred meters from where the nest that they came from in their entire life. And we've been studying those individuals, so we know that. And perhaps because of that, and a few other reasons, they have what seems to has happened here at Palomarin is they are adapting to the drastically changing habitat here. So as the trees are coming in and growing taller, they are just expanding three-dimensionally and using those trees almost as if they are very large shrubs. They're still not flying around or flying long distances the way a lot of other species do, but they're adapting to this tree habitat. And I don't know if Geoff has anything to add as the Wrentit whisperer who might be one of those very surprised by this pattern.
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add. That's all true. But, you know, and they've been shown to be pretty versatile and adapting to climate change. Their ranges has been expanding a little bit up in Oregon and over to the Eastern Sierras, which has really surprised me. And maybe that's because, again, they find a place that they can handle and don't go anywhere. So they're very well adapted to sticking to it, which again, you'd think would be a problem, but again, the bird seems to be pretty adaptable. I know CJ Ralph is on, and he always tells me that Wrentits is one of the most common species they catch in the understory of redwood forests, and when they're using their mist nets, which I always was at a loss to describe, you know, how that they were common in old growth redwoods. But it's probably because they have a nice shrub cover underneath and they've adapted to it.
Awesome, thank you. We've had, we'll kind of pivot a little bit. We've had several questions come in about pesticides and insecticides. Can anyone talk a little bit more about whether there are particular pesticides in common use that are particularly harmful? Is it neonics?
Oh, yeah, that's the danger of mentioning something you don't know that much about. Yeah, so it is primarily the neonics that are in use these days. I know that they're both applied to fields, but also applied to seeds, so birds can ingest the seeds as well. There's lots of great work on birds and insecticides coming out of Canada primarily. So that's about as much as I know about the specifics of the insecticides.
Sounds good, thanks. We've also had several questions about fire and specifically about whether Point Blue is involved in restoration and recovery after the Woodward fire, similar to the surveying that we did after the Vision fire, whether we're taking volunteers and anything along those lines. Would anyone like to take that one?
I mean, I don't think we're currently involved in Woodward fired stuff, although I believe Renée has been consulted for potential spotted owl stuff there. I think it's to be determined about whether or not we get involved in the same way we did after the Vision fire. It's still burning, so even with these rains, probably still burning a bit. So I think to be determined, unless Renée, you know more than I.
I do not know more than you, but I will say with the spotted owl component, the National Park Service has been monitoring the pairs that are encompassed within the Woodward fire perimeter for years before the fire. And so they have that pre-data, and they are planning to continue to monitor those birds as long as they can safely do so in the spring. And so it'll be really interesting to see how the spotted owls respond. We do know that they tend to do all right with low and even mixed severity fires. So of which the majority of the woodward fire was low severity. And so it'll be exciting to see what the owls and other birds are doing in that area next year.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Just wanted to add, I was thrilled to see last Saturday that Audubon Canyon Ranch was doing a prescribed fire after the first rain, a small rain, and they are actively using fire as a tool for habitat management.
Yep, for sure. Okay, we've had a few questions about how to get involved, and one person wants to know about whether there's any areas of study for grad students to work on, and then we've had questions about how to volunteer. What are some opportunities to volunteer?
I could start with that. I could start taking that. So yeah, we have done many collaborations with graduate students, and we are always looking for other opportunities. So please do reach out. At the end of this, Christy will put up our contact info. So potentially reaching out to me or Christy if it's about Palomarin, or to Renee if it's about spotted owls. We'd love to hear from you and talk about potential there. And then in terms of volunteering, so a lot of our projects that do take volunteers, including at Palomarin, where we sometimes take volunteers for bird banding or for data archiving, we aren't doing so right now because of COVID. So again, stay tuned for sort of post-COVID opportunities there, but we do have some other opportunities at the organization. And I think you can go to our website. There's an Engage With Us volunteer page, and it lists some of the opportunities. We have a Soundscapes to Landscapes program where people help interpret and identify the birds that have been detected during with automatic recording devices. So that's pretty great. We have a whale alert app. Geoff mentioned even contributing your data to eBird has a great effect. And we have volunteers doing shorebird surveys in California, and specifically snowy plover surveys in the Monterey Bay area. I think those are perhaps all full up right now, but that's something else to keep in mind for future winters as well.
Awesome, thanks. Anything to add? Let me see if we can squeeze in one more question real quick. Maybe just what is on the top of your wish list for future science at Palo? Maybe just one quick thing from any of you.
I mean, to have a graduate student work with the data. So whoever asked that, please come work with the data. We have a ton of it. I mean, there's so many questions, you know, I think about this relationship for me, you know, sort of between the timing of when birds arrive and set up shop to nest or to overwinter at Palo, and how that timing influences their reproductive success, for example. So these relationships between the conditions about where they were, say in central Mexico, how that influences how well they reproduce when they're at Palomarin. Gets at that annual life cycle sort of stuff that Geoff mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's great. I think we are about out of time. So we had a lot of great questions come in, and I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. But I wanted to, you know, thank all of our presenters again, and to all of you who attended and sent in such great questions. If you do have more questions, you are welcome to reach out to any of us. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to put there it is, our contact info up on this slide. Before we go, let me try to kind of wrap up this conversation with some take-home messages for this question of the day. How are the birds doing? So what we've heard today is that overall bird populations are facing major challenges with multiple causes, including climate change and habitat loss. Our science is helping to track those changes and identify those causes, but it's complicated. Some species are doing okay, others aren't, and it really matters where you're looking and which populations you're studying. So it's really important to continue studying these birds year-round at different spatial scales and over the long term. We also heard today that partnerships are essential for addressing these challenges, from partnering with local land managers and habitat restoration efforts to these continent-wide partnerships and strategies to support conservation. And we're also partnering with all of you. So thank you so much for tuning in today. and for your interest in how the birds are doing and what you can do to help. I am really looking forward to the next episode in this series. Be sure to sign up at pointblue.org/sign-up so you don't miss it. And have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks.